Disgraced comedy legend and convicted sexual predator Bill Cosby is back in court today. His lawyers are attempting to persuade the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to overturn his convictions. Plus, California prosecutors say thousands of people, including convicted murderer Scott Peterson, fraudulently applied for stimulus funds and may have cost the state $1 billion.
Every type of inmate that you could conceivably think of.
But first, the attorney for convicted killer Chad Cobb sits down to discuss the Erica Stefanko verdict and his client's choice to testify against his ex-wife.
I was still at the tree and Erica went in the vehicle and left.
This is Law&Crime Report, diving into true crime and all legal stories making headlines. And welcome to Law&Crime Report, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. We're going to start with Erica Stefanko. It's a trial that we were covering here on the network out of Ohio. Last week, we got a verdict in this case. Remember, she was on trial for allegedly being complicit in the murder, the 2012 murder of Army veteran Ashley Biggs. After many hours of deliberations, the jury came back with their verdict, and here it was.
Regarding count 15, the jury has found the defendant, Erica Stefanko, guilty of the offense of aggravated murder, signed by all 12, dated the 25th day of November 2020. Count 16, the jury has found the defendant, Erica Stefanko, not guilty of the offense of aggravated murder, signed by all 12, dated the 25th day of November 2020. Count 17, the jurors have found the defendant, Erica Stefanko, guilty of the offense of murder, signed by all 12, dated the 25th day of November 2020. Count 18, the jury has found the defendant, Erica Stefanko, not guilty of the offense of murder. Count 19, the jury has found the defendant, Erica Stefanko, not guilty of the offense of kidnapping. Count 20, the jury has found the defendant, Erica Stefanko, not guilty of the offense of aggravated robbery.
Those guilty verdicts on the murder and aggravated murder charges means that Erica Stefanko could face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, her sentencing is January 11th, and obviously we're going to follow that. But a big part of this case, and a dramatic twist, was that Stefanko's former husband, the confessed killer of Ashley Biggs, we're talking, of course, about Chad Cobb, testified against her and said that his former wife played a role in this case, that she helped to lure Biggs out into an abandoned property in order to be killed. Well, we're joined right now by a very special guest. Chad Cobb's former attorney, Donald Malarcik, is with us. Donald, great to have you here on the program.
Jesse, great to be here.
So let's start with the Stefanko verdict. What'd you think?
Well, I was a little surprised. I thought the government had a difficult case. There was really no forensic evidence or any physical evidence linking Stefanko to this murder. Obviously, the jury felt that Chad Cobb's testimony was credible. That, coupled with the confessions and the admissions that Ms. Stefanko made, I think was enough, obviously, for the jury to believe that she was intimately involved in this.
And I want to focus on, I guess I should say your former client, Chad Cobb. His decision back in the day, years ago, to plead guilty to this. What was the rationale behind that? Because my understanding was it was to take the death penalty off the table, which would signal to me that maybe you guys felt that you couldn't convince a jury to acquit your client, that the evidence by the government was just too strong. What do you think?
I agree. It was a very, very difficult case, and my co-counsel and I sized it up. We went through every single piece of evidence that was there. We looked at the police procedures used to gather that evidence, and honestly, we did not feel that anything rose to the level of a constitutional violation. We looked at the evidence and felt that it would be very, very difficult to secure anything other than a life sentence. So when the government was able to take death off the table, I felt that was our best possible likely outcome at trial. And why risk the possible death penalty when they were going to offer life after much consultation and a very difficult discussions, after hours of reviewing the evidence in the case, Chad, I think, made the correct decision to plead guilty and avoid the possibility of a death sentence.
During those negotiations with the government, was there ever a conversation or maybe some kind of hint? Hey, listen, we know Erica Stefanko is involved with this. Chad, if you testify against her, if you incriminate against her, if you ultimately bring her a part of this, we might be able to work something out even further. Was that ever a conversation?
Yes. I mean, I think the government had some inkling that Ms. Stefanko might be involved. They were very interested in talking to Chad. At that time, quite frankly, Chad was not interested in cooperating, was not interested in testifying. He and Erica had children together, and his main focus was to try to leave the mother of his children home to raise his children. So that wasn't part of our discussions. It wasn't part of the plea negotiations, but it was something that the government suspected from early on.
Well, knowing that, were you surprised it took so many years for Erica Stefanko to ultimately be arrested?
It wasn't real surprising. I think the government was certainly looking for new evidence. You know, Chad reached out to the lead investigator on his own, wrote a letter from prison indicating a willingness to help. And this was really, I believe, a family decision. Chad, his family, his parents, Cindy Cobb obviously had a lengthy conversation with Erica that she recorded that was played for the jury that I think was pretty damaging to Erica's case.
And I'm going to get into Cindy Cobb in a minute, but I want to focus on something else. You know, Chad Cobb took the stand. We kind of guessed what he was going to say, but then he shocked all of us when he, under cross-examination, he said this, that again, this is a guy who pled guilty to murdering Ashley Biggs, and yet this is what he said. Watch.
In spite of you pleading guilty, you filed this appeal. Is that your way of not accepting responsibility?
I'm sorry, I don't exactly understand that question.
By filing this appeal, you were trying to overturn your plea?
No, sir. Mind you, my knowledge of law isn't very good, but I believed that the information that was seemingly restricted from coming into the court would have been able to be presented during an appeal, but I didn't know how the law worked, and I found out that that was not the case.
Once you pled guilty, for all intents and purposes, you knew your case was over, correct?
No, sir.
Part of this case, the aggravated murder case, involved you driving Ashley's car to a location in Wayne County. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You were born and raised, well, not born there, you were born in Oklahoma, but you were raised in Wayne County, correct?
From roughly 10 years of age and up, yes, sir.
Donald, you have to explain this to me. He admitted he pled guilty to killing Ashley, and yet on the stand says he's not the one who strangled her. Can you explain that?
Well, no, is the short answer. You know, the physical evidence was pretty overwhelming. I was surprised by that testimony.
What was he gaining from testifying against her? I mean, that was a big question. What is he to gain by this? We talked about it's not like he worked out a deal beforehand. Why do you think he chose to testify at this moment in time?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I really don't want to speculate on Chad's motives. I can tell you based on what I had seen at the trial, that it was clear that there was some difficulties between Chad and his ex-wife. I don't think it's any secret, and it came out that Erica ended up marrying Chad's best friend. I don't think it's any secret. It came out during the trial that there was some custody issues between Cindy Cobb, Chad's mom, and his parents, and her ability to see and have access to her grandkids. I think that certainly didn't help Erica's motive to not get detected, and I think that had some play in Chad ultimately coming forward and agreeing to testify.
Do you think that there's a possibility he was just making things up? Because a part of his testimony, let me rephrase, certain parts of his testimony were contradicted by the testimony of other witnesses. I mean, one point is he said Erica Stefanko made that call to Domino's in the house, and then GC, his daughter, testified that the call was made in the car. Chad Cobb said that Erica ordered a mixed pizza, mushroom and pepperoni, but the Domino's manager said that's not the case. There were these kinds of moments where it seemed that Chad Cobb was not telling the truth. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, I believe, based on my view of the evidence, that Chad Cobb was telling the truth. There were certainly some discrepancies. How major, how minor those discrepancies were, I guess, is up to the jury to decide. I think they felt that Chad was telling the truth, and obviously felt that his testimony was credible enough to convict Erica of these very serious offenses.
But again, he said that he didn't kill her. So I guess a lot of people are saying, I don't believe Chad Cobb. I mean, he said he didn't kill her on the stand.
Sure. Yeah, this is a tough case. I mean, it was a very, very difficult case. I was pleased and fortunate to have death taken off the table for Chad. It's tough to come to terms with such a horrific crime for anyone, and I'm sure it's difficult for Chad. Based on what I saw in the testimony, it was difficult for Erica to come to terms with whatever her role was in this. It was a really horrific, tragic criminal event.
You mentioned Cindy Cobb. I want to get into her role in all this, but we have to take a break. Donald, stick with us for a little bit. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back right after this. And welcome back, everybody. We're talking about the Erica Stefanko verdict out of Ohio, and we have with us Donald Malarcik, who represented Chad Cobb, a key figure in this case. But we can't also forget about Cindy Cobb. Cindy Cobb was the defendant's former mother-in-law who recorded these secret conversations with the defendant. Highly, highly impactful evidence for the prosecution, where Erica Stefanko basically confessed to her role in the murder of Ashley Biggs. Now, Cindy Cobb was on the stand, and she testified about Erica's participation in this. Take a look to what she said.
But you felt that somehow Erica was responsible.
Yes.
Did you believe Erica was completely responsible for him being there, or partially responsible?
Partially, it took two.
It took two. So you accept the fact that your son is at least partly, if not mostly, responsible for Ashley's death. Is that fair?
Correct.
And you said it takes two. How did you know it took two?
She admitted that she made the phone call.
All right. So at some point in time, you made a recording.
Yes, sir.
Who was there when you made that recording?
Just Erica and I.
Where was the recording made?
In our barn.
Your barn?
Yes, sir.
And when you say barn, is it like an animal barn? What kind of barn is it?
It is a renovated barn. It's heated. Our Harleys are housed in there. There's a bar in there.
A bar?
Yes, sir.
What prompted you to record Erica?
Off and on, through the years, we would have issues. If she got upset about something, she would withhold the kids from us. It would be, until we can sit down and talk, the kids aren't going to be able to come over. This happened several times. We had just come back from vacation, and she wanted to meet with me, to talk. And it was during this time where Chad was wanting the divorce, the tools situation, and I decided I was just going to record. Tired of always being called on the mat and always having the kids withheld from us.
Donald, I'd like to get your opinion on Cindy Cobb. During the course of this trial, viewers, the defense, suggested she may have played a more active role in what happened to Ashley Biggs. Maybe she was the one who made that phone call to Domino's, and people found it very curious that she held on to these recordings for years before turning them over to the police. What can you say about this?
Well, I got to know Cindy, Chad's mom, through my representation of Chad. And anytime I'm involved in a death penalty case, we really got to understand, get to know, and appreciate the accused family. We go back almost 3 generations and talk to every family member that we can to try to understand the person I'm representing. And what I found Cindy Cobb to be was a very loving mother who was deeply concerned about her son. As you can tell during her testimony, she wasn't making excuses for him. She knew he had to be held accountable for his role in this. And I also found Cindy Cobb to be a very involved and very concerned grandmother. She would do anything for those kids. And the idea that Erica was going to try to keep them away from her is a huge motivating factor, in my belief, causing Cindy to take some action and do what she could to be with her grandkids.
Do you think she had more to say about the night in question? Do you think there's more that we don't know about her role and what happened to Ashley?
Well, I think Cindy gave all the information that she knows. I don't think, quite frankly, that we know exactly what Erica's role was. I know her not taking the stand was a very, very difficult decision, as it is in every trial. I know initially there was some thought that she might take the stand. There was a break. The judge talked to her and very appropriately said, you know, this is a tough decision and it should be your decision. And ultimately, my memory of the trial is she said, no, I'm not going to testify. So I think there's some things that only Erica knows that we may never find out about her full involvement in this case.
Donald, you had a lot of interactions with Chad Cobb. What can you tell us about what he's like and also his relationship with GC? GC had testified in this case, talked about the close relationship she had with her father, but you had an insight into this man that many of us will never have. So what can you tell us?
You know, Chad was a veteran. He was a guy who had very, very limited criminal history. He was a guy who was struggling, trying to raise his family, and GC, my observation and my information and my investigation told me that Chad did have a very close relationship with GC. And when someone got in the middle of that relationship, it ended tragically. This doesn't define who Chad Cobb is. He's a much more three-dimensional person than this event. This event obviously was a horrific and heinous crime that he's going to pay for by spending the rest of his life in prison. But the Chad Cobb that I knew, the Chad Cobb that I spent time with, was a regular guy who was deeply concerned about his family.
And we're going to continue to follow this case because, as I said, Erica Stefanko's sentencing is in January, and she could face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Donald Malarcik, thanks for taking the time to speak to us about this case.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. We're going to switch gears right now and focus on another high-profile person in the media, person who has a big, interesting legal development. I'm talking, of course, about Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby, the disgraced comedian who was convicted of sexually assaulting Andrea Constand, is currently serving a 3 to 10-year prison sentence in Pennsylvania for his crimes. Well, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has agreed to review Cosby's appeal, and today is when they are hearing oral arguments both by Cosby's attorneys and the state. The big question is, could his convictions be overturned? It's an interesting legal argument. This is actually Cosby's publicist speaking a little bit about the freedom of Bill Cosby and what he represents. Take a look at this.
Witness the unjust conviction and incarceration of a true American treasure and citizen, actor-comedian Bill Cosby. Along with my family and I, and Mr. and Mrs. Cosby, we are praying for your families continue to be safe and well during these difficult times. We ask that you tune in on Tuesday, December 1st, 2020 at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to watch oral arguments that will be presented by our appellate attorney, Jennifer Bungine, before the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court.
Okay, let's talk about this because that was very interesting to watch. I'm joined right now by former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani and Law&Crime legal analyst Julie Rendelman. I'm glad to have you both here. Julie, let me start with you. One of the big issues, and frankly, I think this is the stronger issue, is the idea that the trial court, the judge, shouldn't have allowed these 5 other women, these 5 other accusers to testify in Cosby's criminal trial. They're called prior bad act witnesses. That's kind of what we're seeing, that generally they're not allowed in because he wasn't charged with respect to what they accused him of. You can't say that the Cosby allegedly did this and that's why you should find him guilty of this crime. But that's an interesting question. That's what his argument is. That's what his attorneys are saying. What do you think about what the government's response is? Walk us through this argument.
So it's funny, I watched the hearing as the publicist suggested, and look, I think that Bill Cosby's team makes some pretty strong arguments regarding these issues. Now, it's not unusual for prior bad acts to be allowed in at a trial if they fit what's called Molyneux, if it goes to the identity or the type of crime committed. But the question is whether or not these 5 witnesses that testified, these 5 extra complainants testifying, was more prejudicial than it was probative. And I thought what was very telling was the chief judge, when he was listening to the arguments of both sides, asked the prosecution and said to her, the prosecution said, oh, our case was so strong without these witnesses. And his comment was, well, if your case was so strong without these 5 witnesses, then why the heck did you need these 5 witnesses? And that may be telling about what the panel's view is in regards to what their final decision is going to be.
A curious thing for them to say, considering, remember, Cosby was on trial twice. His first trial, only 1 accuser was allowed to testify, and that ended up in a hung jury. The jury couldn't come to a decision. All of a sudden, you allow more witnesses to testify, he gets convicted. Now, Neama, let me ask you about a different issue. I don't find this one as persuasive, but as a former federal prosecutor, I'll ask you. Bill Cosby says that all these things that he said in his civil deposition shouldn't have been allowed to be brought into evidence during his criminal trial because he says before that deposition, a DA assured him that he wouldn't be prosecuted for what he was about to say. Your thoughts on that? Because the argument is his right to self-incrimination was violated.
Jesse, I agree with you. It's not a good argument. He's represented by counsel in that civil deposition, and any attorney knows, unless you're going to get immunity, nothing that the DA says is going to be enforceable. So I understand why they're making the argument, because some pretty incriminating statements were made by Bill Cosby during that deposition that were used against him in the criminal trial. But it's not a good argument. Unless you get that formal immunity, it means nothing.
Yeah, again, the big concept here is if you agree to be deposed, you're taking your own risk here. Now, Julie, it's interesting because it was almost a surprise that the Supreme Court was going to take up this argument, right? I mean, Cosby had some trouble getting it up here, and I think maybe they were even surprised the Supreme Court wanted to hear this. What does that tell you?
I think, one of the things that has been, people are discussing is the fact that it seems that the Supreme Court wants to make a final kind of decision for, their state in regards to what is appropriate in terms of not only the amount of witnesses that testify to prior bad acts, but the type of witnesses that testify. Keep in mind, it's not, there have been other cases in which 5 witnesses have been allowed in, 10 witnesses have been allowed in. And the thing that is troubling for some people in this case is they felt that the main case was weak and but for this case, but for those additional witnesses, there would be no conviction.
I want to get more into Cosby. There's a few more issues in terms of if he wins on appeal, what could that mean for people like Harvey Weinstein, who faced a very similar kind of case? We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll get into that. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're continuing our discussion of Bill Cosby's attempt to throw out his convictions. His appeal is being heard by the highest court in Pennsylvania. The oral arguments are happening today. And I wanted to take a little bit more time to address the conclusion of this because, Neama, let me turn to you on this. This is interesting. I want to ask you a two-part question. Let's say he's successful. Let's say he's successful and the court agrees with him. What could happen to his case? Do his convictions get thrown out? Does he get a new trial? What happens then, and what would that trial look like? But number two, and maybe this is more important, if the court agrees with him that these other accusers shouldn't have testified, does that mean that other courts in other states, like the Harvey Weinstein situation in New York, will say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't have allowed all these other accusers to testify as to uncharged conduct. Maybe he should get a new trial. Walk us through the aftermath if Bill Cosby has a successful verdict from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
If the Pennsylvania Supreme Court reverses Bill Cosby's conviction, I expect the prosecution to retry the case. It's going to be a much more challenging case with one victim. And most of the time in sexual assault, you don't have a lot of corroborating evidence aside from the victim's own testimony. So testimony of one victim can be challenging to get a conviction, and that's why prosecutors love these prior bad acts witnesses. They like to pile on and overwhelm the defense, and that's how they secure guilty convictions in this case, both for Bill Cosby and for Harvey Weinstein. Now, the law in Pennsylvania is a little bit unsettled with respect to these prior bad acts witnesses. So if the conviction is overturned, it's not binding on another state or controlling on New York courts, for instance, but it would be persuasive authority that I'm sure appellate attorneys would point to try to get Weinstein's conviction overturned as well, because one of the big fights and challenges in that case was this very same issue. How many prior bad acts witnesses could come testify against Harvey?
Well, I don't expect that we're going to get a decision from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court for several months, but we'll be watching what we'll see. We'll see what happens, and I know people like in Harvey Weinstein's position may be looking as well. All right, now I want to turn to something else. There's a conclusion to an interesting legal case. Fox News has settled with the family of Seth Rich. Seth Rich was a staffer from the Democratic National Committee who was shot to death in 2016, and this mysterious killing has spawned a conspiracy theory that he was murdered for leaking DNC emails to WikiLeaks, which was proved to be untrue. And this was actually a theory that was promoted by personalities on Fox News, different programs. Rich's family had sued Fox News and two others, claiming emotional anguish, distress. The settlement from Fox News came right as the personalities like Sean Hannity and Lou Dobbs were to be deposed, or maybe they were about to be deposed that had been deposed. It's not clear, but the timing of that's very interesting. And, actually, to give you a little bit of context, here are the Riches in 2018 when they announced the lawsuit. Take a look at this.
The fact that he worked for the DNC and the timing worked for those who had, other motives.
Seth's parents say there was never any evidence connecting their son to WikiLeaks.
His computer didn't have anything on it. He would never have done it.
But they say that didn't stop Fox News.
Okay, Julie, I'll start with you. We don't know the details of this settlement, obviously, kept confidential, but you're experienced, you're Julie Rendelman. What do you imagine this settlement entails here? What do you imagine the details are? Julie, we have you? Okay, so Neama, as we work out with Julie's audio there, let me turn to you. Neama, again, what do you imagine this settlement says for both parties?
Well, I know Fox was very, comfortable with their position. They wanted the trial court. They expected to prevail. It's tough to bring forward these types of defamation claims. But then the Court of Appeals ended up reversing them, and rather than litigating the issue back in the trial court, having their senior, correspondents and executives there deposed and moving forward with a pretty sort of public trial, I think it was the right thing for Fox to do to, resolve this case. There was really sort of no merit in this claim. And not only did they make it, they really ran with it for some period of time.
Well, What signal does it send the fact that Fox News settled this? I mean, again, as I said, it seems it was right on the heels of people like Sean Hannity and Lou Dobbs being deposed, or maybe they had been deposed. It seems that the timing of this says more.
Well, you have a climate now where, elected officials are much more aggressive, going after, folks for defamation. You have, news organizations that are being sued for the same. So, I expect defamation law to really sort of take steps. You have Johnny Depp, for instance, suing his ex-wife for, defamation, both abroad and here in the United States. So I expect the law when it comes to libel, slander, and just defamation in general to really evolve, and attorneys to be much more aggressive going after news organizations for what they've said, especially the ones that folks might consider on the fringes.
But doesn't this give news organizations pause? I mean, they don't want to be wrapped up in litigation. They don't want to have to settle. And there's a climate where sometimes you say these claims or you make these opinions, and that line between news and opinion gets kind of tricky. Do you think there's going to be a change after seeing this?
Yeah, I agree. It is going to give news organizations pause. And it's just, one of the issues with defamation law, it just varies dramatically, not only within the United States, but, around the world. So for instance, defamation lawyers love filing suits in Europe because the burden is on the news organization or the defendant to actually prove the truth of what they printed or reported, right? Whereas, in states like California, where I am, it's a very sort of First Amendment friendly state. And if a news organization successfully opposes one of these lawsuits, they actually get their attorney's fees. It's called a slap motion. So, the rules that apply really matter a lot in these types of cases. And it can be challenged to defend them, no question, if you're in the wrong venue.
The sad truth is we just don't even know more about what happened to Seth Rich after all of this. We're still left with so many questions. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we have some other big stories to mention. We'll be back. In a big legal blow to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's restrictive COVID-19 measures, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 opinion that attendance limits placed on places on houses of worship is unconstitutional. As you recall, Cuomo had enforced caps on the number of people at places like churches and synagogues in areas that were hard hit by COVID exposure. And newly appointed Justice Amy Coney Barrett sided with the majority, while Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the dissent. And Cuomo said that the ruling has no practical effect. Julie, you're back with us. As a New Yorker, is that true that there's no practical effect from this ruling?
Well, this was a discussion about future times when there was going to be restrictions put in place. And so, no, it doesn't actually affect what's happening right now. I think it's interesting because, you talk a little bit about how the Cosby case can impact Weinstein in other states. Well, now that this decision has been made, we start to look at other jurisdictions, other states that may have similar issues, particularly with the spread of the pandemic and the fact that it is, hospitals are overflowing with patients at this point. One wonders, is this ruling by the Supreme Court going to have such an impact that it's going to increase even more the potential patients that are going to end up in the hospital? With that said, just one other caveat is, one of the discussions that was made is, is it okay that anyone can go to a liquor store and as many people can be at the liquor store and buy liquor, but you can't go and practice your religion? And that was one of the issues they raised as to why it was unconstitutional.
And I know that there are people who look at this decision and say, well, of course, it's going to side on these lines. You have Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the new conservative justice. Of course, she's going to rule this way. But taking politics aside, from a legal point of view, does this make sense? Does it violate the Constitution, what Cuomo did? And that becomes an issue. Like you said, why is it okay for people to do this and people are not allowed to do this? Again, people look at the massive people that come out for a protest or people that go to a liquor store, people that go to a restaurant. And yet, when you talk about houses of worship, they're somehow put to a side. They're specially categorized. And obviously, de Blasio and Cuomo have been accused of basically being unfair to religious groups.
Yeah, and you bring up the protests because I think that is the perfect example. When you have thousands and thousands of people gathered together. Now, granted, that's outside, so there is obviously less health risks when an individual is outside. But yeah, you do start to wonder why there's a delineation between the two. Now, one would think that if both were not allowed to gather, if those protesters were not allowed to protest, and then the religious groups were not allowed to join together inside, then that might raise less constitutional issues, but who knows?
And let me ask you this, Julie. Amy Coney Barrett, newly appointed justice, she helps with the majority here. What did you make of her arguments? What did you make of her stance? Because people are wondering where she's going to side on a lot of these big issues.
Look, I mean, people from people more liberal are obviously going to be much more concerned about not just this decision, but many decisions in the future in regards to abortion and the like. I'm not sure that this indicates any decision she's going to make in the future. I don't think it's a surprise that this was where she came out when it came to this issue in terms of the religious aspect of the pandemic. But I think I hate to say it, but time will tell which position and what position she takes in the future.
And Neama, let me just bring it to you real quick. Andrew Cuomo, who has, gone on a book tour, he has been applauded for a lot of the measures he's taken. I have to imagine for him, this was not something he expected, and maybe it gives him pause before he enacts another measure.
Oh, agree, Jesse. I mean, this is similar litigation in California and Nevada has been unsuccessful. Obviously, we have a new Supreme Court here, and I think Governor Cuomo is going to think long and hard about those essential businesses, right? I think it was Justice Gorsuch that really focused on the liquor stores, the bicycle shops. Really, are those essential? Do folks need to be going there? And is that a reason to limit attendance at religious places of worship, but not those essential businesses? I think he really needs to narrow that definition there in New York.
Well, speaking of the coronavirus, let's stick with this for a second and turn to a different story. Do you remember when the COVID stimulus package came about and it was aimed to benefit millions and millions of Americans, provide financial assistance to them? Well, do you know who may have benefited too? Thousands of inmates locked up in California prisons. That's exactly right. There was an investigation revealed that a scheme where these criminals filed, or someone on their behalf filed, for unemployment insurance and pandemic assistance money may have cost California $1 billion. This includes over 100 death row inmates, including Scott Peterson. So this is huge. And we heard from Anne-Marie Schubert about this. By the way, just to give you context, Anne-Marie Schubert was one of the prosecutors in the Golden State Killer case. You may have seen her before. This is what she had to say about it.
It has been said that there is no honor among thieves. And there is no better example of this than the massive EDD fraud that is occurring within our jails, in our prisons here in California. Tens of thousands of inmates, local, state, and federal institutions all involved. Every type of inmate that you could conceivably think of, murderers doing life or life without the possibility of parole, rapists serving hundreds of years of a sentence or perhaps life as well, child molesters, serial killers, and other murderers sitting on California's death row. Hundreds of millions of dollars that may well amount to upwards of $1 billion having already been paid in their names. It is perhaps and will be one of the biggest fraud of taxpayer dollars in California history. And with this fraud means that victims who have been victimized by these inmates are not getting the restitution that they so deservedly have been owed.
All right, Julie, let me ask you the billion-dollar question. How could this have happened? I don't understand. Explain it to me.
Yeah, so and I think my co-analyst may know better because he's in California. My understanding is that California is one of the few states that does not have a computer system in place to separate those individuals and flag those individuals that are inmates, so therefore that they wouldn't be entitled to unemployment. So one wonders is, obviously there's many individuals to blame for what happened, but there seems to be some measures that need to be changed in California themselves to prevent this from happening in the future. Certainly other states have been able to implement it, and one wonders why California hasn't as well.
Yeah, Neama, let me turn to you. How exactly are they going to unfold this investigation? How does this play out? I imagine this is a headache. I imagine this is incredibly complicated. What are we going to see in the next weeks, in the next months, to unravel this scheme?
Jesse, Julie, I agree. This is a nightmare here in California. I mean, and there's a couple of reasons why this happened. The first is the certification process. Historically, to certify, to receive unemployment benefits, you have to fill out forms under penalty of perjury. Those forms are checked, and if and when you're qualified, you receive the benefits. Well, after the shutdown and the quarantine here in California, they sort of switched that certification process where you apply for benefits, you receive them, and then you certify sometime later. Well, that's a big problem in a state like this where you don't have those checks here. You don't have a computerized system. So you have tons of fraudulent claims that were submitted, the benefits received, and now the state is going back and checking those claims. Well, guess what? You're never going to collect the money from those inmates or those folks. That money is lost, and it's a shame, when you have state governments that are already doing so poorly financially, and you have this massive loss that you'll never recover. So, I do think the state and EDD here has a big part to play in the blame that goes around in this particular issue.
It's shameful. It's horrible to think about this money going to murderers and rapists. I mentioned Scott Peterson, Julie. Scott Peterson is one of the people who says, if I heard this correctly, that he's going to fight this, that he wasn't involved in this. Is there a possibility that these inmates just didn't know what was going on? Some of them they were shocked as much as we all are. And how does that work? Because you have somebody who might be on death row or somebody facing life in prison. Do they really care if they get implicated in a financial fraud scheme? So explain this to me.
I was just going to say, I think the last thing on Scott Peterson's mind is whether or not he stole money. He has other, I hate to say fish to fry in terms of, concerns he has. But it is certainly possible that there is someone else or a group of individuals that are basically scamming and scheming and are able to get the information regarding the inmates, their social security numbers, their date of birth. As we talked about before, things are done very differently, particularly in California and New York as well. People don't have to go in like they used to, show their face and say, I'm not working. This is all through the computers. So it's not very difficult to scam. The problem is now California, and I think it's going to be a lot of other states are now going to have to backtrack and see all the money they lost because I doubt it's just California.
Neama, let me ask you this. We have about a little over a minute. We are dealing with a situation that is just crazy to even think about. Is this the kind of scheme where you believe there's someone at the top, that this might have reached upper echelons that we don't know about yet?
Absolutely. I know the U.S. Attorney's offices here are investigating this. There's organized crime elements. And, this is just the beginning of really sort of one of the most massive frauds in state history. And one other thing I forgot to mention is part of the problem is EDD here sends notices to the employers saying, hey, someone that worked for you or used to work for you applied for unemployment benefits. And they ask the employer to report any fraud. Well, guess what? Most businesses are closed. Businesses aren't checking their mail. Yeah. So that's a bad way to, try to detect fraud under the circumstances here.
What a mess this is. Well, we'll follow and see what the aftermath of this is. Neama, Julie, appreciate you taking the time. Everyone out there, thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime Report. We'll be back tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern. See you then.
Thanks, Jesse.
you.